Hello, everyone. I'm actually here in the Bahamas. You can't really tell because I'm in a hotel room right now, but it's the final day of the Winter Championship. But I wanted to give you all my thoughts on some of the upcoming Journey to Un'Goro cards that have been revealed since my last review. I actually was fortunate enough to be able to take part in one of the reveal streams, which is super cool. I hadn't seen any of the cards beforehand, and so I got to share my thoughts as they came to me, which was a neat experience. But anyway, before we get back from the Bahamas, I want to be able to let you know what I thought about a lot of the cards. I'm just going to jump right in. We'll start with Ozruk. So this is one of the elemental cards. The elemental tribe has the mechanic of getting bonuses if you've played elementals the previous turn. And I like this mechanic because it's interesting in that it forces you to set up for your future turns the turn prior. And that both require some forethought on your part as to how you want to spend your mana over the course of multiple turns. And it also gives your opponent some information about what you might be trying to do so they can potentially set up to try to prepare for that. For instance, if Ozruk is a popular card, it's a 9-cost minion, so maybe people, the turn you play a elemental prior to be able to have 9 mana, they're like, all right, well, I'll set up something like Mirror Entity or Potion of Polymorph or something similar to that. Maybe even they recognize that it's possible you're planning to play Ozruk, so they hold on to a Sap or a Hex or something similar. As for this card itself, I'm not sure how impressed I am by this specific card. It's actually the only one of the elemental cards that we've seen so far that seems to care about playing multiple elementals. Most of them have tended to be, if you played an elemental, do this thing. Whereas Ozruk scales with the number of elementals that you had played the previous turn. And the scaling is pretty powerful. If you have played, say, 3 elementals, you get plus 15 health. But it's obviously a pretty significant investment to play 3 elementals in a single turn. And also, you're just putting a lot of eggs in one basket. This is a 9-cost minion, and if you only played a single elemental, it is identical in stats to an Ancient of War, which is not super impressive for something that requires a lot more deck building and a lot more setup. So I'm not super sold on this individual card, simply because it is very, very expensive for what you get. But I like the mechanic overall. So if there aren't a lot of Saps and Assassinates and there are a lot of aggressive decks, maybe Ozruk is powerful. But again, 9 mana is a lot to pay. So I'm not really feeling like this card will be super impactful. Next up, we have a card that I do think will be really good, which is Kalimos, Primal Lord. This is the Shaman Legendary, or rather the Shaman Non-Quest Legendary. It is a 8-cost 7/7. So twice as expensive as you'd think you'd pay to get a 7/7 in Shaman. But it has Battle Cry. If you played an elemental last turn, cast an elemental invocation. So similar in terms of setup to Ozruk, except not scaling for the number of elementals you play. And these are really powerful spells, the elemental invocations. Now, it is not 100% clear to me whether you get a choice of all of them or if it's a Discover effect. My understanding is that you get to choose, but there's 4 different invocations. And currently, the Discover mechanic covers 3 cards. So I'm curious as to whether you get to choose between all 4 of them. But regardless, all of them are really powerful. The Invocation of Earth fills your board with 1/1 elementals. The Invocation of Fire does 6 damage to your opponent. The Invocation of Water restores 12 health to your hero. And the Invocation of Air does 3 damage to all enemy minions. So these are all very, very powerful things to just tack on to a 7/7 body for 8. If you're looking to race your opponent, there's a number of options. If you're looking to build a board or wipe out your opponent's board, also options. So I think this is just a super powerful card in a Shaman Elemental deck. Yes, it costs 8 mana, but I think it's worth it. You get a really substantial body as well as a number of possible very powerful options that can impact the board immediately. That's a really important thing for high-cost minions, is being able to do something the turn you play them. Next up, we have Stone Sentinel, another very powerful card for these Shaman Elemental decks. If you played an Elemental last turn, summon 2/2/3 Elementals with Taunt. It's a 4/4 for 7. Kind of the reverse of the meme here. But this is basically a minion with Feral Spirits tacked on. And I think this is very, very powerful if you're looking to play a longer game deck that is looking to take advantage of elemental synergies like Kalimos. Interestingly, this is an elemental that has an elemental synergy effect, so you can very easily curve Elemental on 6, Stone Sentinel on 7, Kalimos on 8, and that is pretty crucial because it looks like a lot of the other elemental synergy cards don't necessarily trigger other elementals themselves. They're non-elemental cards. We'll get to some more of those in a bit, but this is clearly just a great defensive option, giving you ways to keep yourself alive. We've seen just how powerful Feral Spirits can be in the current metagame, at least, with the popularity of Pirate Warrior. And Pirate Warrior doesn't lose very much in the standard rotation, so I can very easily see that deck sticking around, though there are clearly lots of powerful tools available to players looking to combat it now. So I think Stone Sentinel will be an absolute highlight, a super role player in the Elemental Shaman decks, and we'll see a lot of it in the future. Next up we have Volcanosaur. This is a big adapt minion, and I don't think this card seems super exciting. It isn't anything that you're going to put into your deck because you want a specific thing. When I was talking to Dean Ayala on the reveal stream, he mentioned that mostly in testing they use this as a big late game finisher. And yeah, you can potentially get plus attack and Wind Fury, and that's very powerful, or Wind Fury and Stealth, and that can be very powerful. But at the same time, it feels like most classes for 7 cost are going to have access to a more powerful dedicated finisher to this. And what you're really getting here is the flexibility of Adapt. Yes, if you get to the late game and you are in a position where you need a finisher, this can do that. But it can also be a defensive minion if you get to the late game and that's what you need. Of course, to be a defensive minion, you essentially have to get Taunt as one of your adapt options in order to be able to defend yourself from your opponent. There's no charge as an option. There's no kill your opponent's minions as an option. They're mostly just sort of keywords and such that go on the minion itself, and Taunt is really the only defensive option for that. So yes, you have I believe 10 options for each adapt. So Taunt being one of them. I'm not exactly sure how the math works out, but you're not at least a big favorite to be able to build what you want with even a double adapt minion. So you really need to be playing a deck that really values the flexibility in order for adapt to be worth putting in your deck. So I'm not really particularly hopeful that Volcanosaur will be a great late game card for really any decks compared to what else is available. Maybe you have Hunter decks that really care about the fact that it's a beast, have ways to buff it, things like that. I don't know. But it is definitely a very interesting card, and certainly a powerful card in Arena, because, yes, there, the flexibility, depending on the game state, can be super important, and it's much closer in power level to what other cards people are playing in that format. Next up, we have Sunkeeper Tarim, a 3/7 taunt that sets all other minions' attack and health to 3. So this is basically keep them all. Keeper of Oldemon AoE, effectively. And this is a powerful card, obviously, against decks that are looking to have multiple big minions in play, or frankly, even one big minion in play. It's very weak if you're getting swarmed by your opponent. You can literally end up buffing their entire team. But if you are in a position where you can have multiple small guys and your opponent has multiple big guys, this card is absolutely incredible, especially because you can immediately potentially attack with those small guys you have into your opponent's big minions. This is a card that I've seen a lot of people talk about as a Jade deck killer. I don't think it's that. I don't think it is a card that will just absolutely win the game on the spot every time against Jade Druid decks, but it is a very powerful tool for mid-range and sort of faster decks against those decks, because if you are able to play a board of small minions like Mistress of Mixtures and Mean Street Marshal, obviously a card that works super well with this, or even just your hero power, you can really end up getting majorly favorable trades. The fact that it has Taunt is really important too, because it can actually allow you to be behind and play it and not just lose. Because if you were to play this from a position where you're in bad shape, a 3/7 for 6 is really, really weak. You can just get run over, even if you do reduce your opponent's minions to 3 attack. But as a 3/7 taunt that makes your opponent's minions 3/3, bare minimum, it can absorb multiple attacks. 2 different minions can attack into it before it dies, and it will kill both of them. So, pretty powerful card, I think. And I will definitely be experimenting with this quite a bit in Paladin decks, especially hand buff Paladin. all the more reason to buff up your little guy. So anyway, sweet. Next up we have Living Mana. It's a really weird card. My understanding is this is actually inspired by the Living Lands card from Magic the Gathering, which was a card that turned all of your lands into creatures, and then your opponent could kill them, they'd be dead. A little bit of a better outcome if your mana treants die here with Living Mana, because you just get the mana crystal back. This seems like a card that has a lot of possible uses, and I like this style of card that's like, okay, do I build a token druid deck where I play Living Mana and look to buff the 2/2s with Mark of the Lotus or Power of the Wild or just Savage Roar and smash my opponent to death? It gives you a way to generate a lot of bodies on the board and a lot of power on the board for a single card, which can be very important for that style of deck. It also could just be a card that you include in a ramp druid deck that you're like, okay, well, if my opponent is playing a deck that has lots of good ways to deal with individual big minions, they can potentially not have as good AoE, and Living Mana can overwhelm them, something like that. There are a lot of vulnerabilities to this card. Some people have talked about Mass Dispel, but that's not really a card people play a lot. Sure, if Living Mana becomes super popular, maybe there are pre-specs that decide to play Mass Dispel against your Living Mana, and they can really get you good. But a big problem in my mind with this is the popularity already of Devolve. Maybe Devolve will reduce in popularity once Conceal rotates out of Standard and into Wild, because you don't have to deal with Concealed Edwin Van Cleef, Concealed Questing Adventurer, which is a lot of the power of that card in the competitive metagame right now. But if you turn all your mana crystals into 2/2s, and then your opponent turns them into Murlocs or whatever, you are dead in almost every situation. Unless you're playing a very aggressive deck that can then Innervate Savage or kill you, you're just not going to win that game. So a lot of risks against a very small percentage of cards in the metagame, but a lot of possible power as well, since this is one card that can just generate so much on the board right away. I'm definitely going to experiment with this card quite a bit. Next up we have Tol'vir Warden. This card was actually revealed prior to the Hunter Quest, which we'll be getting to in quite a bit, actually, because 1-cost cards come last when you're doing reverse mana cost order. But this is a card that you look at it in the surface and you're like, this is a 5-cost 3/5? That's pretty weak. And the Battlecry, draw 2 1-cost minions from your deck. That also seems pretty weak, because you get to the later stages of the game, 1-drops are much less likely to be impactful. But there's a couple of things going on here. One, you always get to choose what kind of 1-drops you're putting in your deck. So these can be cards that maybe have higher impact later on, things like Abusive Sergeant, that, yes, you don't really want to have a draw that you pick up an Abusive Sergeant from your deck, but if you can pull it from your deck essentially for free with the Tol'vir Warden, that can be very powerful. Also, clearly, the quest allowing you to play a smaller number of 1-drops in your deck and still hope to consistently activate the Marsh Queen quest, Swamp Queen, whatever it is, one of those, we'll get to it, is really good. And, you could potentially have your deck built with a ton of 1-drops to try and activate that quest early, or you have maybe even the exact number of 1-drops that you need, and you can play multiple copies of Tol'vir Warden to help you increase the chances that you're able to complete the quest earlier in the game. It can be very, very powerful to just give that extra boost to a mid-range deck, and also have consistently the ability to play early game minions to fight back on the board. And I think that's actually quite powerful in what a lot of mid-range style Hunter decks do. You do run into the problem if you have a lot of 1-drops in your deck, that you just draw a 1-drop on turn 5 or 6, and it's just total air, and it's a real problem. But when you are able to thin them out of your deck with the Tol'vir Warden, it can be pretty strong. I think if this were a beast, I'd actually be very excited about it, because it'd be a high health minion that can also activate Houndmaster and Kill Command. As a non-beast, it's a little bit sketchier, but it's also true that Hunter doesn't really necessarily have good 5-drops in mid-range decks most of the time. Often you find yourself playing Tundra Rhino, which isn't necessarily a great drop in a lot of circumstances, or maybe you find yourself playing Stranglethorn Tiger, which can be great against certain decks, but it's very weak against others. So there's kind of a hole in a lot of mid-range Hunter decks that I think Tol'vir Warden might be able to fill. So I'm definitely interested to see how this card plays out. Next up, we have Vilespine Slayer. This card's gross. This card is a very powerful card. It's combo destroy a minion. And people talk about, oh, you can coin out so many things in Rogue that are very powerful. But just being able to coin out, say your opponent plays a Flaming Faceless, coin out Vilespine Slayer. They are so far behind. We've seen a lot of rogue decks already, punish decks that play sort of individual mid-range minions on turn 4 or 5. There's been the sort of conversation about, like you can't play Savannah Highmane if rogue is popular because they sap it. It's like, well, you're really kind of stuck if you play anything on like turn 4 that you get coined Vilespine Slayer, because that is just such a huge tempo swing. Because it leaves a body behind too. With sap, you obviously give the minion back to your opponent, they can replay it, but with Vilespine Slayer, you can play like a longer game potentially against a mid-range or even a controlling style of deck, and be able to kill their big threats and go sort of card for card with them without kind of just running out of impactful things to do, because you're able to pressure them with the Slayer as well. It's a super powerful value card as well as a super powerful tempo card. It's just a super powerful card. So I think this is going to be a real staple of a lot of rogue decks in the years to come. Next up, we have Gentle Megasaur. I'm not really sure if I've actually talked about this before, but it's a 5/4 beast for 4 with Battlecry Adapt Your Murlocs. Even if I have talked about it, we have new context, of course, because there is the Shaman Murloc quest. It gives you more reason to play a bunch of Murlocs in an individual deck. Also worth noting, it is a beast that cares about Murlocs, so it goes very well into any kind of deck using Curator, or potentially Zubat, Menagerie, Magician, things like that. It is a beast, too, that you play on 4, potentially Menagerie, Magician on 5, so you can have a very powerful Menagerie curve in those decks. So definitely a card I'll be experimenting with, either in Menagerie, completely Menagerie-focused decks, or in just a Murloc deck. Adapting your Murlocs is very powerful. If you have a swarm of Murlocs and you get +3 attack on them, or you get Wind Fury on them, if you get any kind of offensive ability on them, Poisonous to attack into big taunt minions. Super powerful. There's a lot of things that can be really strong on even just 3 small Murlocs. You're getting a swarm of guys that you can potentially significantly buff. Very, very powerful. So this could easily be a card that is a real powerhouse in a Murloc deck. Imagine calling the finishers into this guy. Super good. You can just blow your opponent out. Next up, we have what I think is one of the strongest cards in the set that we've seen so far. Is Tol'vir Stoneshaper. This is an Elemental Synergy card, 4 cost 3/5. If you played an Elemental last turn, gain Taunt and Divine Shield. So this is the Elemental Senjin. So if you played an Elemental, you get a super Senjin. And that's just very strong. We've seen even like the power level of something slightly buffed more than Senjin with Twilight Guardian. Twilight Guardian, super powerful against a lot of decks. Tol'vir Stoneshaper, against decks with small minions, like a lot of 1 health minions, 1 attack minions, it'll behave fairly similarly to a Twilight Guardian at times. Against decks that are relying more on hitting with big things, like mid-range decks or sort of late-game Pirate Warrior, essentially, it's incredible. It can absorb multiple hits from big things, and that's really, really strong. And it happens to curve incredibly off of another excellent defensive minion in Tar Creeper. So you can essentially play a 3/5 taunt against an aggressive deck on turn 3, and then a 3/5 taunt with Divine Shield against that deck on turn 4. You're going to live. You're going to be able to find a way to live to the later turns if you are playing this package in your deck, this sort of very strong defensive pair for turn 3 and turn 4. So I think this card is one of the superstars that we've seen so far from Journey to Un'Goro that can fit into a number of decks. Obviously, it does require elemental synergy, so it's not something you just throw into your decks. Kind of along the lines of the Twilight Guardian. If you're playing the right package in your deck, this can give you significant rewards. So super excited for this card, and definitely looking to try it out to crush some Pirate Warriors. Next we have Mana Bind. This is a Mage Secret. When your opponent casts a spell, add a copy to your hand that costs 0. This is a weird card, because a lot of times when you're playing secrets, you're looking to disrupt your opponent in a particular way, whether it's counterspell or spellbender, ace block, whatever else. This is a card that you're looking more to do something proactively with, because it does not actually disrupt what your opponent is doing. It doesn't stop your opponent. It doesn't answer their spell. Like Mirror Entity, for instance, is a secret that kind of just answers your opponent's minion, because you can just attack your minion to their minion a lot of the time, or just attack their face and kill their minion, which is often even better. This, your spell goes off, and now I get a copy of it, which means It has powerful synergies with a number of spell synergistic cards in Mage. Obviously, if you have, say, Archmage Antonidas in your deck, and you're able to mana bind, frankly, anything, that can be pretty powerful, because you get access to their card for free to pair with your Archmage Antonidas later in the game. Even like Burgly Bully Get Coins are really strong with Archmage Antonidas, let alone be able to steal your opponent's, let's say, Fireball. Your opponent's, I don't know, Powered Shield even can be quite strong. It is true that you have to have a spell. They have to cast a spell into your mana bind that you later have some sort of valuable usage of. Because if you're playing, say, Tempo Mage, and your opponent, Shadow Flames you, like, well, I don't necessarily have a great opportunity to use a Shadow Flame later against a Warlock control deck. And they also clearly know you have it, so it makes those sort of situational cards that people can play around much more difficult for you to get value out of. But it also costs 0. So you can really fit it into your turns in a very interesting way later on. So I like this card sort of conceptually. I'm not sure where it fits into a deck that's looking to use it competitively, because it's just hard to find a time to play a card like this, and hard to ensure that it actually gets value in a meaningful way. All right, next up we have Mimic Pod, which I actually hadn't seen prior to seeing it on the spoiler list. I kind of must have missed it during the spoiler reveals. Basically, this is half a Thistletea. You draw a card, get a copy of it, whereas Thistletea, obviously, draw a card, get 2 copies of it for half the mana. So it's obviously much less powerful than Thistletea, but more easy to include in a deck and more easy to use because it doesn't take up your entire turn. It obviously also works very powerfully with the Rogue quest, which has since been revealed, that wants you to play 4 copies of any individual minion. So Mimic Pod is a lot easier to use than the Thistletea in that kind of deck where you're looking to turn something on quickly, and where you may only need a little bit of extra push in terms of making a copy of something. So I think that this is a cool card. It's effectively draw 2. This is your Arcane Intellect of Rogue. It doesn't dig you as deep as an Arcane Intellect will, but it will effectively give you an additional card for the cost of 3 mana. And you're going to often, when you're playing this card in your deck, be interested in having multiple copies of any individual card because of things that care about the duplicates like the quest. So I actually expect this card to potentially be a card that sees just a lot of play in Rogue decks in general as just card draw. If you're not looking to use Gadgets and Auctioneer, you could potentially play a more value-focused Rogue deck, a control-focused Rogue deck with Mimic Pod to just be your ability to gain card advantage. And kind of a cool thing. You can Mimic Pod into the Vilespine Slayer. It's like, all right, slay you, slay you, slay you. Next up, we have Curious Glimmerroot, which is a really neat card. You look at 3 cards, and then if you guess which one started in your opponent's deck, you get a copy of it. This is an interesting card because there's a number of things going on with it. One, there's kind of this mind game of, okay, what am I going to select? What do I think my opponent is actually playing? And the less predictable your opponent's deck is, the worse this card is. So this is, people talk a little bit about you want to have a deck that's kind of unpredictable. When you're playing, say, on ladder, you want to be able to surprise your opponent. And if Curious Glimmerroot is a popular card, that is even more important, because otherwise your opponent just gets a free card every time they play a Glimmerroot because they know exactly what's in your deck. I'm told that the sort of algorithm from which this selects cards ends up being better than random. It is more likely to choose cards that are in players' decks, generally speaking, as part of the selection. So it's not just like, hey, is it the Execute, Angry Chicken, or the Murloc Tide Caller? It's like, well, it's probably the Execute. So one thing that I don't like about this card is the implications it has for the current tournament rules for Hearthstone in many cases. Because right now, when you're playing in any kind of televised or broadcast Hearthstone tournament, the deck lists are revealed to the players, which just makes Curious Glimmerroot have no meaningful drawback. It has no meaningful choice. It's literally just take the card is in your opponent's deck. And that's lame. That's really lame, I think, because it completely goes against what this card is trying to do. It's trying to be this interesting little puzzle that a player can get rewarded for solving. So I kind of hope that maybe we see a shift in that philosophy regarding competitive Hearthstone events. We probably won't because, I mean, it's probably not worth the cost, really, in other ways to make this card actually interesting. Next up, we have Gluttonous Ooze. It's one of the cards that we revealed on the stream that I was involved in. Super cool. This is a card that you will play instead of Acidic Swamp Ooze, or in addition to Acidic Swamp Ooze, if you care about your opponent just killing you with those weapons. I've seen a number of people saying, oh, rip Swamp Ooze, like Gluttonous Ooze is just better. That's not true. There's lots of decks and lots of situations, even in the same decks, you'd rather have the 2-drop to kill your opponent's weapon than the armor from killing your opponent's weapon. Even in decks against Pirate Warrior, very often I would rather be able to play Acidic Swamp Ooze on turn 2 to kill their Fiery War Axe or even their Rusty Hook or whatever to prevent them from using it to kill my minions. Whereas with Gluttonous Ooze, yes, you get a bigger value from it, but it's slower, so you give your opponent more opportunities to attack with the weapon they play early in the game. So I like that there's this choice, and I like that there's a way to specifically decide that you want to react to weapons that your opponent is using to kill you rather than your minions, compared to, say, Harrison Jones. Harrison Jones is a card that if you're looking to play a longer game, a sort of controlling game against decks that include weapons, Harrison Jones is very powerful because it gives you this card advantage. It gives you your resources back, and that's very different than what you want against, say, Pirate Warrior. Against Control Warrior, like, all right, I want Harrison Jones you, get some more resources so I can keep playing minions, and you can't kill everything because I've gotten this incremental advantage. Gluttonous Ooze is obviously pretty bad against a Gorehowl in a Control Warrior deck, not because gaining 7 life isn't good, but because you care more about your resources than you do about your life. So there being a variety of choices people can make, and those choices being meaningful in different contexts, I think is very valuable for this kind of card. Next up, we have Mirage Caller, another one of the cards we revealed on the stream. Super cool card. This is basically mini Herald Village that obviously works very well with, say, Death Rattle minions, and particularly well with Death Rattle minions and the Priest Quest because it summons that minion. And the Priest Quest only cares about summoning minions, not about playing minions from your hand. So you get sort of acceleration of your Death Rattle count without having to play 100% Death Rattles. It can also be used with, say, Elementals. You get an Elemental the following turn. Probably not going to do that, but it's a use for it. You could potentially copy something like a Ysera or Ragnaros. Rip Ragnaros in Standard, though, so you're not going to be doing that most likely. But just generally, this is the kind of puzzle-solving card where you decide how you want to sort of fit this kind of synergy into your deck. You get multiple uses of the same passive effects, the same Death Rattle effects, if that's what you're interested in. And, you play a Loot Hoarder into this. You just are able to effectively get an extra Death Rattle for your count for your quest, if that's what you're doing, as well as just get more sort of card draw going with your Loot Hoarders. So I just like this card. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be a staple card in Priest decks because it's not a powerful body in a lot of things, but if you are playing Death Rattles, I expect this will be a card we see a lot. Primalfin Lookout. Battlecry, if you control another Murloc, discover a Murloc. I like that this is another card that's looking to make sort of honest decks out of Murlocs. I talked about this a lot when we saw the previous set with cards like Blowgill Sniper and things like that, that you want to have ways to play Murlocs that aren't just like combo decks. Because that's what we've basically seen from Murlocs for a very long time. You basically only see Bluegill, War Leader, and maybe Cold-Blade Oracle. You didn't really see just normal Murloc decks. And this is obviously a card that's making you want to play Murlocs, and you need to have multiple Murlocs to get this guy going, etc. It's also clearly very strong with the Shaman Quest to play 10 Murlocs, because this is a card that can effectively give you 2 Murlocs. As to how powerful this card by itself is, well, obviously not by itself. You need another Murloc. It's just, the stats are pretty bad, but that's true of most Murlocs. So I think that there's a decent chance this sees play in Murloc decks, dedicated Murloc decks, specifically that are trying to do the Shaman Quest, simply because you want to have more opportunities to pick up those Murlocs. That said, it can be difficult to have your Murlocs survive because they are so weak, so maybe it will not really end up being able to see play because you're unlikely to go like Murloc into this without just having no Murloc in play for the battle card. All right, we have Corrupting Mist. This is kind of a cool card for Warlock. Corruption everything. It's weird this isn't like Seed of Corruption, because that's an actual Warlock spell that actually puts corruption on everything, from my understanding. But regardless, corrupt every minion, destroy them at the start of next turn. Kind of like a Doomsayer-ish like effect for Warlock alone. I like it. I think that it goes into sort of the Warlock theme, as Dean Ayala said when we were doing the reveal for this. Warlock often has things that are powerful but cost it life. And you can Corrupting Mist your opponent's board, and that board will die, but your opponent can just tackle it with everything in the face. Kind of like a Doomsayer in that way. And unlike Doomsayer, though, there's no risk it dies. You're pretty much guaranteed that you can play the Corrupting Mist, and all your opponent's stuff will die. So I think this card is pretty sweet. It's a card that is pretty strong with, say, Dirty Rat. Dirty Rat Corrupting Mist, kind of like Dirty Rat into Doomsayer, but unlikely for your opponent to be able to actually take advantage of the fact that they got an extra minion in play, because there's no Doomsayer for them to kill. Everything's going to die. Maybe we see more Purifies if this is a popular card. Purify Priest, it's coming. but yeah, and I think this is definitely a card that we'll see play in some controlling Warlock decks. As to whether a lot of controlling Warlock decks will be as popular once Jackson rotates, that's unclear. But this is a card that I think would see play in some of the existing Warlock decks that are played now, if it were already legal. Obviously, compared to Doomsayer, you don't block your opponent's next turn. They can just play cards into it, unlike a Doomsayer where you play a Doomsayer and they can't kill it. They're like, all right, attack you in the face, go. You get this massive tempo swing, but it is unkillable, so there's that. All right, next up, Flame Geyser. Deal 2 damage at a 1/2 elemental to your hand. If you're playing a mage deck that looks for elemental synergies, this is probably quite good, because you got a removal spell and you can turn on your other synergies. Kind of as just a staple type sort of card. In many cases, 2 damage kills a lot of things in the early game. You can kill 3/2s like Sorcerer's Apprentice, Cult Sorcerer, but a lot of decks don't necessarily have early game stuff that is vulnerable to this. This doesn't kill a Blood Cell Raider, but it doesn't kill a reasonable number of things in the early turns. So it's kind of like a Lava Shock. Lava Shock was a card that wasn't necessarily as effective as a removal, but also gave you these other synergies that you cared about later on. So there is the opportunity to use spell damage to kill things with it. You can kill some of the early minions like Flame Imps and such. A lot of the power of this, I think, will be contextual as to what sort of minions people are playing. If they're playing a lot of 3/2s, this is great. If they're playing a lot of 2/3s, this card's much, much worse. All right, next up, Shadow Visions. This card is weird. This card's very weird. Discover a copy of a spell in your deck. So if you're playing a combo-style Priest deck, this gives you a lot of flexibility. One of the problems that Priest decks can have that are looking to rely on combinations like, say, Pint-Sized Potion, Shadow Word Horror, is they have the wrong card at the wrong time. This gives you access to more of the right card at the right time. You can also just be playing, say, a burst damage-based Priest deck that's looking to Velen Mind Blast your opponent to death. You can get an extra Mind Blast. You can get, an extra Powered Shield. If you only have 3 other spells in your deck, then you have a very high chance of getting whatever you want at a time. Say your deck is, only has Mind Blast, Powered Shield, Shadow Visions. Those are your only spells. I guess you have another one. Maybe you want to have a little bit more flexibility. Every time you cast Shadow Visions, you're either going to get a Shadow Visions or one of those spells. And that's really powerful in terms of having a number of duplicate cards that you care a lot about. Like, for instance, say you're playing Purify Priest, keep the meme going. If your only spells in your deck are Silence, Purify, Shadow Visions, and Powered Shield, you always have access to that Silence effect for all of your minions all the time. And obviously this is, we're talking about kind of meme deck or whatever, but that's really strong. But yeah, there are lots of corner case cards in Priest that are great when you have the appropriate situation, and Shadow Visions can let you find them in the appropriate situation, or you can just be playing a deck that just wants specific cards and wants as many of them as it can get. That's really strong. So I definitely think this is going to be a card that we'll see play in those sort of synergy-based, situational spell-based decks. And I'm curious to see if it ends up finding a home and powering those decks up significantly. Speaking of powering decks up significantly, Clutchmother Zavas is totally nuts in Discard Warlock. This is a 2-cost 2/2. Whenever you discard it, return it to your hand, it gets +2/+2. If it didn't even say it gets +2/+2, I think this card would be okay. To some degree, because, hey, you can continuously fuel your discard stuff. Obviously, Warlock doesn't really necessarily need that because they have life tap, but Yeah, this is a card like you play, turn 1, Coin Librarian. Turn 2, hey, look, I discarded my Clutchmother, 4/4. It's gross. Obviously, it's like a super dream scenario, but the more cards you want to discard in your deck, the better cards that make you discard become. You can very easily have a deck that has Doomguard and the new, Fellhound. And, you can very easily get, like, Clutchmother, Silverware Golem, discarded on, like, turn 4, and then you play your Clutchmother and your opponent just is getting blown up. One thing that's interesting, the quest that wants you to discard 6 cards, that doesn't work if you're discarding no hand. If you have an empty hand and you Doomguard, you get no bonus. With the Clutchmother, if you've discarded this, it lets you keep fueling those discards for that quest as well. So it does matter sometimes whether you have an empty hand and you're discarding or you have something. And this can be that fodder that later in the game, all right, I get a 2-cost 6/6, 2-cost 8/8. Super powerful. This is going to be an absolute superstar in those decks. Next up, we have Hydrologist. This is a Murloc. Battlecry, discover a secret. 2/2 for 2. It's a Paladin card. Paladin secrets kind of stink, but it's pretty low cost to put in your deck. You're getting a slightly understated minion as a 2-drop, but it has this additional value that gives you this flexibility. Paladin secrets are pretty weak, generally speaking, but if your opponent doesn't know what they can predict, it's actually secret. If you can get a Noble Sacrifice, your opponent doesn't know you have a Noble Sacrifice. They can't really play around Noble Sacrifice in quite the same way. They can try and play around it, but you can punish them because they tried to play around the wrong secret quite often when you're actually just getting something outside your deck. So I think this could be a powerful card. Paladin has lacked early game, and one of the problems with a lot of the early game you might play, say a Flame Juggler or something, is it's so low impact later on. Whereas a card like this, you can play, a 2/2 for 2, or you can hand buff it, play a 3/3 for 2, and then get a little bit of incremental board impact later on. I think this is actually a card that could be pretty strong in hand buff style decks, because one of the problems those decks have is that because they typically tend to play huge amounts of minions to maximize the value of buff everything in your hand, they don't have that many cards that allow them to interact outside of combat. And being able to get access to Redemption or Noble Sacrifice or even Sacred Trial or whatever sometimes can be quite powerful because your opponent isn't expecting it, especially if something like Sacred Trial. Why would you take a Sacred Trial? Come on. And it can just swing the game for a very low cost for 1 mana. You don't want to put a 1 mana secret in your deck most of the time because it's not worth drawing. That's why we saw those secrets only really see play once Mysterious Challenger existed. But it can definitely be something that's worth getting off of the battle cry later in the game and really disrupting your opponent's turn. So I think this is a good card, and I'll be trying it out. Next up, we have Molten Blade, the Shifter Xeris of Weapons. It's basically what it is. It's a Shifter Xeris of Weapons. This isn't a card we're going to see in competitive decks. Yes, it can give a Doom Hammer to a warrior who can then Heroic Strike and hit you for 20 damage or whatever it is, but it's not going to really see play in competitive decks. You have so many options that you can play in your deck already for a better weapon in most cases. You could have it sit in your hand as a pirate warrior or whatever and just hope. It's not what you want to do in that kind of deck. You want to know what your cards do. You want to have consistent, powerful tools at the right stages of the game. Maybe you want, an extra Arcanite Reaper. Sure. This is a meme card. This is a card that's going to be in highlight reels. It's not going to be in competitive decks. All right, now we are to the 1-drops, almost to those quests. We'll start with Lost in the Jungle. This is a 1-cost spell that summons 2 1/1 Silverhand Recruits. Cool card. It's obviously pretty straightforward. It feels like a worse Living Roots. But if we look at Alley Cat, for instance, we can see that there's a lot of room for there to be things that are worse than Living Roots that are still pretty good. It may not seem obvious to you, but Alley Cat is pretty good. Alley Cat is a strong card. If it weren't for Patches and N'Zoth's First Mate, I think Alley Cat would actually be a great card. But it just sort of is oppressed by the fact that those cards do exist. But one of the bigger things is that Paladin really struggles to interact in the early turns. A lot of Paladin decks don't really have things they can do on turn 1 that are good. And a lot of cards that Paladin has previously played or does have access to that they could possibly play on turn 1 are weak because of the same reason Alley Cat is often weak. They're just too easy to kill with N'Zoth's First Weapon or Patches. Though Alley Cat is one of the most resilient things. It's actually more like the reason that Fiery Bat is weak. Fiery Bat was a card that saw a lot of play. Now it doesn't really see any play. Hunter doesn't really see any play, but that's sort of beside the point. But we don't see 2 1s for 1. Is more the point because of Patches and because of N'Zoth's First Mate. because they can easily just be killed by that free patches. But if you're making 2 cards, 2 minions with a single card on turn 1, that gives you much more ability to interact, much less vulnerability to just the free patches killing your thing. You can potentially just kill their 1-drop as well. So even perhaps more importantly, if there are things that care about Silverhand recruits, let's say there's a card like Quartermaster, this can be a very powerful card with those. At 1 cost, this can interact very well with anything. Like Steward of Darkshire. You play Steward, you play this, you get 2 1/1s with Divine Shield for 1 mana. Or with the new Paladin Legendary. You can play this for 1 mana and get 2 3/3s. And that's really powerful. There's lots of things that Paladin has to buff or otherwise give advantages to their small minions or just their minions in general. And be able to make 2 minions for 1 mana is really effective with anything. So if there's a new card like Quartermaster, something that buffs your recruits, or just the cards that I just named, a lot of things that already do exist that we know about, this could be a very powerful card with them. So I expect this will see a lot of play. Next up, we have Crystalline Oracle, the new Priest 1-drop. This is a Shifting Shade for 1 mana, basically. And Shifting Shade, I think, is a pretty interesting card, but always felt a little bit understated for its cost. But I think we'll potentially see more play now that there's more reasons for Priest to play Death Rattle minions specifically. And this card, obviously, Death Rattle minion that works with the quest, works very well, potentially with the Mirror guy, if you're able to keep it alive for a turn. Yeah, it fits into the curve. You can just play that guy and this guy on the same turn, get 2 of them. Works with the quest, accelerates you to your reward. Just kind of a role player type card. Priest has kind of struggled in many cases with having proactive things to do early that don't necessarily cost them a card. Northshire Cleric, for instance, unless it is able to trade with something or attack into something and get a heal off, is often just kind of a dead card in a lot of situations early in the game, like against like a Totem Golem or Fire War Axe. It's obviously great against 1-drop 1/1s or whatever, but Crystalline Oracle, your opponent has patches, and maybe this trades with their patches, but you get a card from their deck. A lot of cards from their deck are going to be bad for you, but you at least are reducing the incoming damage that is happening in the early turns, and able to sort of help bridge to your other sort of death rattles in the middle game. So I don't know that this is necessarily going to be an ultra powerful card, but it's obviously a role player in death rattle decks. Speaking of role players, Firefly. This is a card that's very likely, I think, going to be a kind of a staple in elemental decks. 1/2 for 1, which is very important in the world of patches, able to contest those early pirates in a lot of matchups. A card that will help against any other 1 health minions in the early game, which there probably won't be a ton of thanks to patches, but works so well against patches and works so well at enabling your elemental stuff later in the game that I think this is a card that will see a lot of play in elemental decks. And Glacial Shard, another 1-drop elemental. This is a card that can go into elemental decks specifically, but also I think is a card that has a lot of potential just in aggressive decks generally. It's 2/1 for 1 that can freeze an enemy. This can also freeze an enemy hero. So if your opponent has a weapon, for instance, you can Glacial Shard their face. They can't swing their weapon next turn. This guy's going to be able to attack, and your other minions, they might be able to be protected from their weapon as well. So I think this card is kind of innocuous. It seems like, how good could this possibly be? But freezing an enemy is actually a very strong effect. It can go very well in, say, a deck with, Rip Icelands, but with Cryomancer or things like that. More tools if you have stuff that cares about freezing. You could use this in a deck with Shatter. I think Shadow rotates out too, but regardless, I think it's a kind of a neat card that has some potential to protect itself and your other minions from weapons or opposing minions. All right, it's quest time. Let's talk about the quest we haven't seen before. We have already seen the Priest quest. We've already seen the Warlock quest. So let's jump into the Rogue quest, which is play 4 minions with the same name. The reward is Crystal Core, which makes all of your minions 5/5 for the rest of the game. Now, this is probably my favorite quest. Not necessarily because I think it's the best, but because I think it has the coolest quest you actually go on to finish it. A lot of the other ones feel like build your deck this way, which is what you want from some of the quests, certainly. You want some number of the quests in the set to be very straightforward so that you're just like, okay, I get it. I build a deck like this, and that's my goal. This one, though, there's some gameplay stuff in addition to some deck building stuff. You want to play cards like Mimic Pod, you want to play cards like Shadow Step, but you also need to sort of maneuver the game in a certain way in order to actually get the reward. So I expect we'll see this quite a bit with cards like Swashbuckler, with cards like Novice Engineer, basically minions that have value that they generate themselves that you want to play with cards like Shadow Step. And maybe you play Gadgets and Ferryman. Maybe you play Pandaren Brewmaster. Maybe you just play Shadow Step. Maybe this is just a card that's in your deck kind of incidentally and you're not totally built around. But obviously the reward makes you want to have a lot of cheap, small things. One of the funny things about this is that all your minions are always 5/5. So, you complete the quest with, say, Novice Engineer, and your opponent's like, okay, you have a 5/5 now, I'll hex it. Your frog's a 5/5 too. It's just an ongoing effect on all your stuff. When you play it, it becomes 5/5, and then you can buff it after that, but anything you play for the rest of the game, for whatever reason, even if you don't play it, your opponent gives it to you for 5/5. So, super excited to experiment with this. I think it'll be a lot of fun. Well, the memory card on the camera died, and I had to move down to the venue for the championship since we're about to start. But anyway, 2 cards left to talk about, which is the Shaman Quest, which requires you to play 10 Murlocs, and then you get Megafin, which is a 5-cost 8/8 that fills your hand with Murlocs. This kind of reminds me of Neptulon, which was a card that I originally tried way back when it was released in Murloc Shaman decks, but it was kind of a weird card because it didn't really care that you were a Murloc deck or not. It just was a card that could give you cards that were valuable in attrition matchups regardless of what you were playing. So this is a really powerful card for sort of an honest Murloc deck that's looking to not necessarily combo your opponent out, but actually win with Murlocs. It works very well with Call in the Finishers because it cares about summoning Murlocs, not playing them from their hand. So you can generate 4 Murlocs with a single card, and eventually exchange your resources with your opponents, and then suddenly your hand is just full of Murlocs, and you have a cheap 8/8. So I think this is actually potentially a powerful card you might see in competitive decks. It may be good enough to actually make Shaman Murloc decks a viable strategy. So I'll definitely be experimenting with it, and I'm looking forward to really mitigating the major drawback that Murloc decks have, which is just running out of cards. And the last card we have, which amusingly we revealed right here the other day, is the Hunter Quest, which is the Marsh Queen, which gives you Queen Carnassa if you play 7 1-drops. This, I think, is a very strong card in Hunter because Hunter really relies on having the ability to get board control with early minions in many cases. And you often want to play a bunch of 1-drops in your deck, but if you draw them later in the game, they're exceptionally weak. So if you're able to get value out of playing your 1-drops later, and actually get the Queen Carnassa, which is a huge dinosaur for cheap, that also puts a bunch of 3/2s for 1 that draw you a card into your deck, can really help you reload later in the game. It allows you to kind of play the swarm mechanic in Hunter, either just outright, you just play a deck that's full of 1-drops and try to power this out very early in the game, but can also be just a component of a mid-range deck that happens to have, say, exactly the number of 1-drops that you need to trigger it, and then you can just use, say, Tol'vir Warden and things like that to enable it late in the game. So anyway, that is it for my reviews from Un'Goro so far. I'm sure I'll have lots more to share with you guys soon, but for now, it is time for the championship.